everyone. Welcome back to Refugee Matters, a series where we unpack topics that impact folks of the refugee and immigrant experience and those who have experienced forced displacement. My name is Luis Garza, and I am the Legal Services and Capacity Manager at NPNA, the National Partnership for New Americans. Today's episode will be bilingual in English and Spanish, and today's topic is about LGBTQ plus migrant justice. El tema de hoy va a ser bilingüe en inglés y en español. Bienvenidos a todos a este episodio especial. So as you know, Pride is typically celebrated in June. However, conversations about LGBTQ plus migrant justice should be happening year-round, especially as over the past year, there has been a large number of anti-LGBTQ legislation that has been introduced across several states, causing major concerns regarding the rights and well-being of LGBTQ plus people in our country. And in this time, in the time of post-Title 42, we are seeing xenophobic narratives that continue to unwrap in the media against our refugee and immigrant communities. So that is why today's episode will be discussing the work that organizers are doing on the ground across the United States to address these challenges and respond to the needs of LGBTQ plus people seeking asylum. And so I'm excited to have multiple speakers today that have joined us. I'm honored to share space with you and lift up the work that is happening across the country. So let me introduce you to our great speakers today, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So feel free to post those questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'll start with introductions here, and then we'll go into questions for each one of our panelists, and then questions from the audience. So first, let me introduce you to Arely Wesley. Arely is originally from San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and has been the youth organizer for Breakout since 2016, dedicated to the Vice to ICE immigrant campaign and growing the organization's Latinx LGBTQ plus youth based. She's active in several organizations, local and national organizing groups, as well as in board membership. And as a migrant and LGBTQ plus rights activist, Arely is dedicated to the liberation movement in all aspects of her life. Arely currently serves on the board of SAYERN and on the community advisory board of the Ruth Fertel Clinic. She is currently a project consultant for the Home is Here Community Resource Center system and supports their anti-detention organizing. Welcome, Arely. And then let me introduce you to Julie Yael Ward. Julie is the daughter and granddaughter of Eastern European refugee survivors and has a deep belief in the power of collective liberation. Julie Yael has been a refugee movement lawyer and organizer for migrant justice and protection for 20 years and has dedicated her career to ongoing learning about creating spaces of safety and belonging. Julie Yael is a founding co-director of Home is Here, NOLA, and former Louisiana State Refugee Coordinator. She has worked with many nonprofits in the United States, as well as with the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees. Welcome, Julie. And then we also have Victoria Castro. Victoria Castro is an immigrant trans woman from Ahuachapan, El Salvador. Victoria is an advocate for trans migrants, HIV, COVID test counselor, a specialist trainer in PrEP, HIV, and renowned makeup artist. She has worked as a health educator, educating and empowering Salvadorian transgender people so that they have the tools to fight for fundamental human rights. She arrived in the San Francisco area in 2018, where she continued for 5 more years doing work as health educator, program manager, and other key roles, and is part of many national movements for trans and queer, Latinx, and immigrant communities at the intersections of trans and queer rights and migrant and racial justice. They currently serve as the organizer for Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement, working to end trans detention. let me just do this one really quickly in Spanish. De Victoria Castro es una mujer trans, inmigrante de Aguachapán, El Salvador, defensora de inmigrantes trans, consejera de pruebas de VIH, COVID, capacitadora especialista en PrEP, VIH y reconocida maquilladora. Ha trabajado como educadora en salud, educando y empoderando a las personas transgénero salvadoreñas para que tengan las herramientas para luchar por los derechos humanos fundamentales. Llegó a San Francisco, California en el 2018, donde continuó durante 5 años más trabajando como educadora de salud, gerente de programas y otros roles clave, y es parte de muchos movimientos nacionales para comunidades trans y queer, latinx e inmigrantes en las intersecciones de los derechos trans y queer y la justicia migrante y racial. Actualmente se desempeña como organizadora de Familia, Movimiento de Liberación Trans, queer, trabajando para terminar con la detención trans. Bienvenida sea Victoria. Y también tenemos con nosotros a Janicet Gutierrez. Janicet Gutierrez is a transgender immigrant Latina from Tuxpan, Jalisco. She's the co-director with Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement, a national trans and queer Latinx and immigrant grassroots organization organizing at the intersections of trans and queer rights and migrant and racial justice. The organization's vision is to work at the national and local level to achieve the collective liberation of trans and queer Latinx folks by leading an intergenerational movement through grassroots organizing, direct action, and advocacy. Janicet advocates for transgender rights and immigrant rights and prioritizes centering the voices of trans women of color in all racial justice work. Janicet is determined to fight against all oppressive political and social institutions that stand in the way of the rights and dignity of all people. Welcome, Janicet, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to have this conversation with all of you. So with that, let's just jump right into some of the questions. And so let me start with you, Areli. Can you share with us your background and what got you involved in this work?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Areli, and a little bit of my background is I'm a trans Latina woman. I'm original, like you say, from San Pedro Sula, Honduras. I have come to the United States when I was like 12 years old, but the whole criminalization and criminal system got me going through many hard times in life where I had to actually learn how to like deal with it and protect and fight for myself and my freedom and also for my community. And what got me to this work, it will be the needs that I have when I started to show the world who I was, and also my own community, to making sure that people who come behind us is not going through what us as a trans woman going through. And I know there is a lot of things that we are still fighting for, and that's why we are. At least I got involved in the work because I know it was very much needed at the time.
Thank you, Areli. So I know you're working with many folks that are newly arriving to the United States, that are part of the LGBTQ community. Can you tell us more about the systems that are most impacting the folks that are arriving, that are part of the LGBTQ community, that are just arriving to the US right now?
Yeah. First, I'm honored to be with my two trans sisters in here, Jenny said and Victoria. I'm very happy to be with y'all and sharing a space with y'all today. Yeah, I think yeah, I've been working a lot with newly arriving immigrants, not only through homies here, but actually to my journey as an organizer. And I think some of the stuff that are really like impacted the newly arriving immigrants is the fact that we still be putting on cases, the fact that people don't understand our needs and the needs that we have of freedom, that we don't are like created to be in cages, and specifically trans people don't need to be in cages. We need to be free and actually to be focused and fighting for our own issues. And I think some of the hard things that we have when we have new arriving LGBTQ migrants come to the country is that we first get on cases. I will say actually the lack of language justice, the lack of knowledge about rights. Most of the people they come to the United States and barely new arriving immigrants don't know about rights. Sometimes we don't even know that we have rights in this country. And we come over here, and when we come here, the system is so shady and so like I would say fake that actually don't even like have development translation for people in detention center when they're supposed to be a translation and language justice access for people who is actually migrant because they know that they will not speak the language. And when we come over here, most of the time we've been putting on cases. Sometimes officers just come to our cells because they put in us in isolation, and officers come to ourselves and just like give paperwork that we don't even know what the paperwork's saying. And I'm talking with from my own experience when many times I have officers come and like to and touch my door on the cell blocks, asking me to sign paperwork, and I say that I'm not going to sign because I want to read it first. And the paperwork actually saying that we are actually requesting protection to be put on cell isolation, which is not that's not true. And many times they make look like we are the one asking for it when it's not right and it's not true. No one wants to be put in cases for days, for months. And that's some of the impacts that we have with community. The community don't know actually much about rights, and they don't have actually knowledge about language justices. And it's many organizations that we are doing that work with. There is a lot of people who actually need, and some of them sometimes don't have access to information or to resources. And then when they get out of the detention center, another issue that we have to face is like lack of housing and education, jobs, because it's very hard for people to find a job, to get access to job, and to get access to housing. We're trying to support and defer people to different agencies where they can support them, but it's not enough for community.
Thank you, Areli, for sharing about that. General, some of the barriers that are faced and how the systems are impacting newly arriving folks. So let me turn to you, Julie, for a question. If you can talk a little bit more about the current efforts happening across the country to address the need for housing for LGBTQ people seeking asylum. Kind of going on to what Areli has mentioned.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say how powerful it is to be in conversation with all these incredible community leaders. And I want to just introduce like the context for our involvement and why I was invited to be part of this conversation. Home is Here works in the Southeast in Louisiana, which has like the terrible distinction of being the world's incarceration capital. And so as Areli mentioned, this place, like so many places, is rooted in the prison economies of the Deep South. We have 9 detention centers down here, and they're all in remote rural areas. And Louisiana detains more immigrants than any other state outside of Texas, which has doubled in the last 2 summers since Biden's inauguration. And most of the people that are detained here, an estimated 85% are asylum seekers who arrived at the Mexico border, or US-Mexico border, requested legal protection, and then were transferred here by ICE. And so many LGBTQ migrants are caught up in this system, along with all the other migrants. And so for this reason, we sometimes explain that Louisiana is our country's second interior border. And that, like, as an interior destination state, we've been receiving these transport buses for years, except our buses are from ICE. And so we really didn't have an infrastructure in place to support any arriving asylum seeker, reception and long-term community support upon release. And the federal government was pouring billions of dollars into locking people up and investing no dollars in post-release shelter or support, which is, as Areli mentioned, so much more complicated for LGBTQ community members. And so that's really what impelled us to start this work and informs our approach, which so many LGBTQ immigrants know from lived experience that the best solutions, and many times the only solutions, are in abundance among the everyday people who are able to live and build community alongside you and the people that show up. And so we call this like true community-based systems when people offer to build their own resources in mutual aid and solidarity to create housing and other support. And so based on our experience with these kinds of models last year, in August, we held a webinar to contribute to this conversation on different models of community-based housing and long-term support with newly arriving asylum seekers, and many folks may have attended that. And afterwards, so many people who are organizing on the ground in communities all over the US requested a space for learning and peer support from other people who were also on the ground organizing in solidarity. And so we started a monthly online community of practice to sort of share collective learning and engage in sort of like deep dive thinking about what it takes, the practice of actually implementing support models in communities all over the country. And so, as Aurelie explained, it became very clear that we needed a more specialized conversation about how to have appropriate and safe housing alternatives with the LGBTQ community members that were arriving. And so our practice included partners like Familia, TQLM that's joining us today, Border Butterflies, the LGBTQ Task Force, the Transgender Law Center, the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, so many. And from this sort of brain trust of folks, we had some learning takeaways over many months around that conversation, that basically there's these 4 kind of buckets that people of models that LGBTQ organizers and groups have experience with. There's shelter, there's the shelter model, there's a hosting model, there's co-living, and then of course there are people who are living independently on their own. And some of the takeaways from that are, with the shelter model, which isn't technically housing, but many newly arriving LGBTQ community members end up in shelters, are that they're problematic for lots of reasons, especially if they're mixed with, they're not dedicated shelters for the LGBTQ community. Obviously, one of the primary problems is that like residents may not be accepting or safe, and lots of misgendering and conflicts can come up. And so the consensus is that like mixed shelter environments really only work for a very short term, a day or two, and require lots of staff, making sure that people are safe. Dedicated shelters for LGBTQ community members have worked. They're better because things like gender transitions and connections and support networks are easier, but this model still requires a lot of specialized staff. And there's people were sharing, there's just a huge amount of trauma, especially for trans folks who are just getting released from detention, and safety considerations like survival work and addiction. And so it was just noted that there's very few shelters with this kind of support available. And same with host homes. It was clear, people were sharing that this really can only ever work if hosts or hosting groups are queer friendly and gender affirming, and that hosts themselves have access to their own network of support and training. And even then, people just prefer to be living with other members of the LGBTQ community. So these hosting relationships can be difficult to sustain for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And so consensus is that, like with shelters, hosting really only works well for the short term, and only with appropriate, sensitive, skilled hosts. Many people were finding some success with co-living, which is really just people living in a house together. And there's lots of different ways that people do this. It can be mixed. It can be dedicated LGBTQ community members. You can have rent required or not for any period of time. The best models, the ones that people really had success with, were dedicated for LGBTQ community members, specifically for immigrants. And even then, folks who are trained to be queer friendly, available for good accompaniment and support is really important. And if people aren't in exactly the same situations or status, for example, like if some people have access to a work permit or documentation and others don't, there can be some tensions or conflicts. So it's frustrating for people to be living together with staff who are not in exactly the same situation. So recommended that folks maybe not live in that home. And also we're mentioning that there are dynamics around the traditional nonprofit model of case management that has been harmful to queer immigrants. And there's a culture of like community that's by us and for us, and a preference for accompaniment and care and humanitarian work over traditional case management models. And so then the last model, of course, was like direct placement into independent living. There's very few people that are doing this formally, partially because people seems like they would rather be, most folks would rather be living together. And so in general, what's happening in lots of cities is that mutual aid assistance is happening for folks on a one-to-one basis. For example, girls who lived in a home and then started one on their own are now renting a house, and with the support of local organizers and activists are creating their own co-housing and queer-friendly housing spaces available. So yeah, there's just a diversity of models, and each one can work for different time periods and with the right resources and good support.
Thank you, Julie, for sharing those models. So, many of the folks that join these events online are part of the refugee and immigrant rights movement. And do you have a recommendation, a way for these folks to get more informed and connected with this work that you're talking about happening with LGBTQ asylum seekers? And maybe like, how can folks join this community of practice that you mentioned?
Yeah, folks can join the community of practice by emailing me, jward@homeishere.org. But I think what's really important is that there's a need to acknowledge that so much of the work that's happening is happening outside of government or even outside of nonprofit systems or anything that's funded by philanthropy. And so I'm sure many of your listeners know well that there's this really powerful informal network of, for example, trans immigrant elders or others who have learned how to survive, and they're in communities all over the US, and they are the ones that are serving as bridge builders and resource connectors for newly arriving immigrants in cities all over the US. And they are the ones that are supporting people in real ways through their own networks. But you won't find them in nonprofit leadership or publicly running programs or even working at nonprofits because it's not safe or accessible for them to lead in these spaces. As Arely mentioned, there's so many barriers. They could be undocumented or language access issues or organizational culture barriers. So these folks are on the ground operating through word of mouth or Facebook groups or WhatsApp channels or relational networks, and are helping with projects here and there. And I really feel like if people really want to be connected to the work, it's important to ask questions. And I just urge you to get to know the people who are organizing and serving as these connectors on the ground. And even if nonprofits are like not formally led by LGBTQ community members because of these structural barriers, to find organizations that are working to support these leaders on the ground and invest in them and in these leaders directly to the extent possible, because resources are really needed for them on the ground to be in leadership.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for that. And we share the contact emails in the chat so folks can reach out. La siguiente pregunta que tenemos es para Victoria. Victoria, como organizadora con Familia Movimiento de Liberación Trans Queer, ¿qué desafíos has encontrado en tu trabajo? Y Cristian, I'll turn to you.
Hola a todos, gracias por el espacio. Sí, pienso que en general hay muchos retos, ¿verdad? Ya mis compañeras han mencionado muchos de los retos que existen y que estos son retos generales que estamos trabajando y nos encontramos la mayoría de personas que trabajamos para la comunidad.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have encountered a lot of different barriers, and as a community, we're working to break down those barriers on behalf of our community.
Ya, y principalmente como una mujer trans inmigrante que vivió la experiencia directa, como muchas de los y les compañeros, puedo entender para mí cuáles son los retos principalmente más importantes que han sido más duros de navegar para mí.
Yeah, so personally, as a trans immigrant woman who's lived this experience, and also have had the opportunity to have this experience with many other people on the gender spectrum, it's very important for me to do this work.
Ya, es importante para mí remarcar que encontrar un espacio seguro para las personas cuando recién llegamos a este país buscando asilo es uno de los retos más duros, ¿verdad? La mayoría de personas no contamos con soporte de ninguna otra persona y estamos soles en este país. Entonces, uno de los retos más grandes para mí trabajando ha sido encontrar espacios seguros en los pocos recursos que existen en el país para personas trans y LGBT migrantes.
Yeah, it's important for me to highlight that we need more safe spaces for people and secure spaces for trans and LGBTQ people seeking asylum. Not having a safe space and a secure space for us is one of the biggest challenges. When we first come into this country, we come without any support from anyone else back home for the most part, and when we come here, we're alone in this country. So for me, it's even been difficult finding a place to work where I feel safe with my identity. So again, creating those safe spaces for our community is really important.
Y así también es muy importante recalcar para mí que la justicia del lenguaje también es muy importante, ya que llegamos a un país y tratamos de encontrar los servicios. Los pocos servicios que existen muchas veces no tienen la opción de dar una justa justicia del lenguaje para las comunidades migrantes. También los pocos servicios o fondos locales que existen en diferentes áreas simplemente son para áreas específicas. Entonces muchas veces es difícil encontrar los servicios fundamentales para las personas que justamente han llegado en busca de asilo o que hemos llegado en busca de asilo.
So, another barrier that it's important for me to highlight is the aspect of language justice. It's very difficult to find the small amount of resources that are available. And then on top of that, there's the added barrier of inaccessible to immigrant communities due to lack of translation. And on the same note, many funds that are set up for community members also lack language accessibility, and many are restricted to very specific communities. So it's really difficult for people arriving in communities to find these resources in the first place, and a lot of them don't have that language access, which becomes a barrier.
Sí, y justamente a esto se agregan demasiados otros retos que existen alrededor de trabajar con nuestra comunidad, como encontrar servicios legales, encontrar servicios de salud en lugares que no son tan seguros para nuestras comunidades. Como sabemos, en todo el país, las personas que buscando asilo llegan con diferentes personas o diferentes sponsors en diferentes ciudades y no tienen el acceso a diferentes servicios, como ya los he mencionado, salud, legal, y esto es un reto para las personas que hacemos el trabajo organizando, porque no no encontramos servicios muchas veces en espacios donde la comunidad es asignada o es enviada.
Apologies. All these barriers that I just highlighted, those are in addition to many other challenges, like finding a job or legal services or health services. And within those services that are safe for communities like mine. When people are arriving in the country seeking asylum, they arrive in various different communities and they don't know where to find those resources. So for us, doing the organizing on the ground, that's one of the main tactics, finding resources where we can help connect people to spaces where they can feel safe in their new home.
Sí, Victoria, y hablaste sobre tu trabajo como organizadora. ¿Nos podrías hablar un poco más de los proyectos en los que estás trabajando actualmente para tratar de eliminar algunas de estas barreras y llenar algunas de estas necesidades de las personas que están buscando asilo?
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah. You share more about the projects that you're working on to address the needs of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants?
Ya, claro que sí. Justamente ahora mismo trabajamos en lo que es poner fin a los centros de detenciones, ¿verdad? Que es una de los trabajos que es más importante para mí, ya que viví la experiencia en carne propia de lo que es estar prisionera del sistema.
Yeah, in fact, today we worked on some of our work putting an end to detention centers. It's one of the most crucial aspects of immigrant justice, especially for me personally, since I've had the excruciating experience in being detained and put into one of these detention centers.
Ya, sí, es muy, muy importante para mí trabajar en esta área porque, como lo he mencionado muchas veces en otros espacios, los llamados centros de detención no son más que cárceles que nada más están matando a nuestra comunidad y metiendo temor a nuestras comunidades que estamos buscando seguridad, ¿verdad? Entonces, eso es lo que principalmente estoy trabajando como organizadora y...
Yeah, so, this work around putting an end to detention centers is one of the most crucial aspects of this work. As I've mentioned here and in many other spaces, the whole label of a quote unquote detention center is nothing more than a jail that kills our community members and frightens our communities as a whole.
Ya, y también estoy trabajando en un movimiento con familia TQLM, que es Familia en el Sur. Justamente estamos llevando esta campaña y movimiento a todos los estados del sur específicamente, donde estamos trabajando con organizaciones locales para elevar el trabajo local y conectar un poco con las comunidades que están bajo ataque en este momento en todo el sur.
Yeah, so, I am working on this movement with Familia TQLM, who are operating in the south of the country. So we have been taking this campaign of movement to states in the south where we're working with local organizations to elevate the local work and at the same time connect our communities a bit since they're experiencing similar injustices across the country.
Ya, y este movimiento es muy importante porque recordemos que actualmente hay muchos proyectos anti-trans que están que están pasando, ¿verdad? Ante personas que tenemos los mismos derechos que todos, que son derechos fundamentales que nos corresponden. Y es importante movilizarnos como comunidad y movilizarnos trabajando en equipo, ¿verdad? Para poder saber que el sistema sepa que estamos unidos y que podemos y que estamos aquí, ¿verdad? Y que los pocos derechos que hemos logrado recuperar que fundamentalmente nos corresponden no se nos remuevan, ¿verdad? Así que en esto estoy justamente trabajando actualmente.
Yeah, this movement is crucial right now because there are many anti-immigrant and anti-trans legislation that are moving across the country. And even though we recognize that we have the same fundamental human rights as any other human being, it's really important to organize, mobilize, and work as a team to protest the system that gets rid of our rights and let our presence be known, so that the few rights that we have been able to claw back stay ours. And these are rights that we won't ever give up, and we're working for those fundamental human rights for everybody.
Sí, gracias, Victoria, por compartir más sobre tu trabajo y sobre esta campaña que están haciendo en el sur del país, y sé que hay formas de mantenernos involucrados para apoyar este esfuerzo. So thank you, Victoria, for sharing this information, and especially about your work and how the campaign in the south of the US is going, and how folks can get involved. So now we'll turn it over to Jenicet Gutierrez, a question for you. So right now, as we've been talking in this conversation, we're living in a time where anti-trans legislation is being passed across the United States in an attempt to criminalize trans survival, trans lives. So, however, as we know, for many trans migrants, their survival has been criminalized for years. So can you speak more about some of the challenges that trans migrants face that you are experiencing with?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me in this conversation, and also an honor to be sharing space with everyone. It's really difficult, right? These attacks that we are seeing across the United States, especially with anti-trans legislation, it's nothing new for our community, and also is impacting heavily undocumented LGBTQ folks, especially undocumented trans women, right? So I want to really, name that the U.S. immigration system has blood in its hands, because we lost the lives of Victoria Arellano in 2007. We lost the life of Roxana Hernandez, from Honduras in 2018. We lost Joanna Medina in 2019. And, it's unfortunate that, their lives were not really protected, right? So, and then under the Trump administration, many migrants die in detention under horrible conditions because of the lack of providing support or medication. Then COVID hit, and there's many lives that have been lost in this system. So this system will never have the interest for the community, especially trans undocumented women. And they already explained some of the pieces that are moving. What are we doing, especially at the grassroots level? It's connecting with people, finding out their needs. So, with immigration policy pretty much being on hold, and nothing it's moving as far as the solution, people are really trying to figure out what's going on, get information, right? People are trying to get to the border safely, especially through San Diego and Tijuana, and wanting to apply for political asylum, right? And that's on hold. Or there's been some changes where the Biden administration did end Title 42, but at the same time didn't find the solution that the community has been advocating for years. And I think one example is the entrance detention campaign that Familia, with so many other organizations and leaders like Areli and Victoria and so many others, have been saying we need a solution. And here is the memo that their voices were, part of what we are asking the Biden administration to do. It was attorneys who were providing their legal perspective. and people who are running, shelters, like Julie mentioned, right, that they have the best interest. And that memo is pretty much sitting somewhere in immigration, and they're not really prioritizing. They're not really doing enough to protect and prevent more people from dying in ICE custody, whether in their attempt to get to the border or while they are in detention. So there's people that what they did do, which is not the best solution, is create the CBP1, which is an application that already has a major issue for many people coming because they come with no resources, if any. So they have no access to get a cell phone, to get, you know, connected. And how are they going to use an application that for the most part is in English and Spanish? And they have to be in a specific place. They cannot just leave El Salvador, for example, and come through, because then this new policy saying you have to apply from your home country. But again, many times trans migrants in particular cannot stay because it could be a matter of life and death. So that is a huge challenge that people have. And also understanding these changes that are happening, that it's making it harder for LGBTQ migrants, seeking protection. So once the ones that do have access to a phone and apply, they also need to have like a sponsor. They need to have a US address, that many people don't know how to connect, don't know how to, trust people that they're going to, support them through the entire, process of seeking asylum, and making sure that they are taken care of while their decision is being made, right? So also the lack of sponsors to be able to support LGBTQ migrants, especially trans women, it's lacking in a major scale. The need for people trying to fight for their lives it's really devastating, right? So that's why all these organizations on the ground are doing everything we can to make sure that we are mobilizing our people, whether it's through campaigns, whether it's through direct services, to make sure they are heard and that they get the support that they need. And there's a lot of work to do. And all these attacks that we are seeing in the United States, it's also being, felt across the globe, right? Because migration is a global issue. And no matter how tough things get with the trans community or at the border, we're not going to stop existing, and we're not going to start moving, because we just want to find a community that we are part of, that we belong, and that we have every right to exist in any part of the world.
Thank you, Jennifer, for highlighting some of these challenges and the ways that this and previous administrations have failed trans and LGBTQ communities. So going along some of the efforts that you mentioned, what do you think are some ways that the broader immigrant rights community, movement, organizations, what can they do to step up to protect LGBTQ migrants and asylum seekers?
Yeah, we have a huge challenge ahead with the system, with immigration, with the attacks openly. And then we also have a challenge within our own communities, right? We have the immigrants' rights movement, the broader movement. We have the LGBTQ rights, where they don't want to prioritize and support, the needs of the community. So one of the first things they can do is listen. Listen to the voices like Areli Wesley, who's doing powerful work in New Orleans. Listen to Victoria's testimony and the advocacy that she has been doing even back in El Salvador. Just take the moment to listen to the issues people who are impacted by this unjust, racist, transphobic policies are having in real people's lives. because they want to sometimes the system or people who are not part of the community want to paint us as like we're something new, and we are not. Trans people have been part of humanity for many many years. Trans people belong to the fabric of society. We belong to families. I'm fortunate enough to have the support of my family, my blood family, that now after years of struggle in understanding who I am or understanding myself and being open about my identity, again, I'm fortunate to have their support and their love, and they, support me, the work that I do. But the reality for many other people in the community is that the family still in 2023 don't want to have them under their homes if they come out as LGBTQ or specifically trans, right? So the movement should not be doing the same. They should not be excluding our issues, because again, we've lost people in custody, and that's not okay. No, it's not okay for anyone, any human being seeking protections, to find death in custody, so they can start listening, they can start challenging their own spaces. If you have been having conferences year after year and you have not in any way included the experiences and the pain and the struggles of LGBTQ plus migrant people, then I don't know what's your solution? Or why do you think it's okay to exclude certain people from from the fight for justice and equality and all that? So I think people need to start creating more spaces, find a way to support the leadership of people that have been for many time excluded. And that doesn't mean that we haven't been at the front lines, is that we haven't been giving the support or the resources that we need to be able to, to fulfill our dreams, our goals, to reach our potential and to really lead to make a significant change in the system and to save lives. So, there's many things that they can do, but the thing that they should not do is repeat oppression, systems of oppression, or exclude voices that are really being hit heavily under racist, homophobic laws that are just doing a lot of harm.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for that very clear call to action for folks that are listening and the broader immigrant rights space. So with that, we have some time to go around with our panelists to get some final thoughts, final words, and especially any final lesson that you would like folks that are listening in to take, or any call to action that you have for folks that are tuning in. So we can start with you, Arely.
Yeah, I think all the participants and everybody in the room have shared a lot right now, and I think the call to action is clear. And it's really like needed to support trans leadership, include trans people on their spaces and their agendas, and actually to make sure we actually push this government to end trans detention. And now, because we need to end trans detention now, we've been losing many trans people in detention centers. We have our people getting traumatized when they get out from there, that we have to deal with it every day, day by day, with trans people getting traumatized and also criminalized after they get out from immigration detention center, because there is not resources for jobs, education, and housing. And in some ways they have to survive. So invest in trans people, and also call to action to push this government to end trans detention now.
Thank you, Arely. Same question to you, Julie.
Yeah, I feel like our friends have said it best. And yes, to support leadership, trans leadership and queer leadership on the ground, especially in spaces where we know that the LGBTQ migrant community is being impacted the most. So, of course, one of those spaces is in detention centers. Of course, those spaces are in detention centers, areas where there are the highest numbers of detention. Of course, those spaces are in areas where they're systemically excluded, like housing, like workplaces, and to find the organizations that are working in those spaces with community leaders who may not otherwise have a space to lead.
Thank you, Julie. Y la última pregunta que tenemos es, ¿cuál es una lección que quieres que las personas que nos están viendo se lleven el día de hoy o un llamado a la acción? Para ti, Victoria.
Gracias. Sí, de mi parte, primeramente honrar a las personas que están haciendo el trabajo, que estamos haciendo el trabajo, también honrar a las personas que hicieron el trabajo antes que nosotros y también gracias, ¿verdad? A las personas que están aquí compartiendo su experiencia y su trabajo.
Yeah, thank you so much. For my part, first of all, it's really important to honor the people doing the work, such as the people on this call, and honoring people that have laid the groundwork on behalf of us before us. And thanking all the people doing all this amazing work for the community, such as the folks here.
También muy importante para mí honrar a las personas que han sido asesinadas por el sistema que hace eso, ¿verdad? Matar a nuestras comunidades y decirle a los demás que seguimos aquí luchando que no desistamos, que somos fuertes y que unidos y unides somos más poderosos y que hay un dicho muy importante que aquí estamos, no nos vamos y si nos echan nos regresamos, así que vamos a seguir en la lucha.
Yeah, also very, very important to me to honor those that have been murdered by the system. The system kills our communities, and also to let others know that we're here in the struggle, that we stand united across gender identities, and that we are powerful. Reminds me of this saying in Spanish, we are here, we're not going anywhere, and if they get rid of us, we'll be right back.
Gracias, Victoria. La misma pregunta para ti, Jenicet. ¿Alguna otra mensaje final, llamado a la acción? So any call to action or final message?
Yeah, no, thank you so much again for this space and this conversation and everyone who listened. I know it's not getting any easier. We do have an upcoming presidential election that, with the same energy that immigrants' rights, organizations and the movement at large is doing to protect, immigrant communities, to also protect trans immigrants, who are in this country undocumented, who are seeking asylum at the border, to not throw us under the bus, right? That we don't let fear, divide us, because that's what they're trying to do. Again, they're just coming really hard against, the immigrant community. We see that in Florida, we see that in Texas, and the sentiment it's spreading very, horrific in social media. And the same goes for the trans community. They're going after trans, youth, and trying to separate parents, calling it a child abuse, some tactics that they use at the border to separate families and the children, that many people saw the images, right, of kids being taken away from their parents. So this is nothing new for people in power. And again, trans people have existed, we exist, and we will continue to exist. So challenge yourself, get uncomfortable, but do not throw us under the bus, because we have every right to fight alongside you for a better future.
Thank you, Jennifer. What a beautiful and powerful way to end this session today. So I really want to thank all of our wonderful speakers. It's been an honor for me to share space with you and get this conversation today. So really appreciate your insights, your experiences, and sharing all the powerful work that you're doing throughout the country. So as we close out today, I really like to thank everyone who joined us. Muchas gracias a todos por haberse unido a este evento y ser parte de este esfuerzo. Gracias por compartir sus historias y compartir el trabajo que hacen a lo largo del país. So please remember to stay tuned for new We All America events on our website and Facebook page, where you can find more information about future events. We also want to give a shout out to the partners, of course, that joined today, that made this conversation possible. And you can visit their website and more information in the comment section to learn more about the actions and the events and activities coming up with all these wonderful leaders and activists throughout the country. So muchísimas gracias de nuevo a todos. Que tengan un excelente día, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you again for sharing. Thank you, everyone, and hope everyone has a great night.